They called her the woman who signed a $2 billion deal in heels while 8 months pregnant. But 24 hours earlier, she was standing in silence, watching her marriage end like it meant nothing. The flash of cameras lit up the glass walls of the conference hall, each burst of light reflecting off polished marble floors and cold steel tables as Emily Carter stood at the center of it all, one hand resting lightly on the curve of her belly, the other holding a pen that would soon change everything. But before the applause, before the headlines, before the world knew her name, there was a quieter sound. One far sharper than any camera shutter, the soft, deliberate slide of divorce papers. Across a table. 24 hours earlier, the air inside Daniel Whitmore's penthouse office felt too still, too controlled, like even the city outside knew not to interrupt what was about to happen. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline in muted gray. The late afternoon sun filtered through tinted glass, casting long shadows across the room, and Emily stood there, her posture steady but her breath uneven. Dressed in a soft cream maternity dress that contrasted sharply with the sharp lines of the office. Across from her, Daniel didn't sit, he didn't hesitate, he simply placed the documents in front of her with the same detached precision he used in board meetings, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression unreadable, as if this moment were just another transaction to finalize. "It's already been reviewed," he said, his voice calm, almost bored, the kind of tone that made it worse, because it carried no anger, no emotion, just finality. Emily's fingers hovered above the paper, not touching it yet, as if contact would make it real. The faint hum of the city below pressed against the glass, distant sirens, muted engines, life continuing as hers paused in place. She didn't look at the signature line, she looked at him. Searching for something, anything, that resembled the man who once held her hand like it mattered, but all she found was distance. Behind him, slightly out of focus but impossible to ignore, stood a woman in a fitted black dress, arms crossed, watching with quiet confidence, her presence unspoken but understood. Emily didn't acknowledge her, not because she didn't notice, but because she refused to give that moment any more weight than it already carried. "You'll be taken care of," Daniel added, adjusting his cufflinks as if the conversation required polish more than empathy. "This is the cleanest solution for everyone." And there it was, the word solution, like she was a problem to be managed, not a person who had built a life beside him. Emily finally lowered her hand, her fingertips brushing the edge of the paper, the texture crisp, expensive, intentional. Her other hand instinctively moved to her stomach, feeling the faint movement beneath. A reminder that not everything in her life was negotiable, not everything could be reduced to numbers and signatures. She inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that steadies you when everything else is shifting, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow, the edges fading until it was just her, the paper, and the quiet understanding that this wasn't the end of her story, even if it was the end of theirs. But Daniel didn't see that, he only saw what he believed he was leaving behind, and that was his first mistake. The silence after his words did not break all at once, it stretched, thin and fragile, like something that could snap if either of them moved too quickly, and for a moment Daniel seemed almost impatient with it, his fingers tapping once against the edge of the table, not loudly, but enough to remind her that time, in his world, always moved forward whether people were ready or not. Emily lowered her gaze to the document. Scanning lines she already understood without reading, legal language that turned years of shared history into bullet points and clauses. The terms were generous by any public standard, a downtown condo, monthly support, medical coverage, everything calculated to look fair on paper, everything designed to close the chapter cleanly. But there was no line that accounted for the quiet mornings they used to share, no clause that mentioned the way he once talked about building something lasting. And as her eyes moved across the page, something inside her shifted, not breaking, not collapsing, but realigning in a way she could not yet explain. "You should sign today," Daniel said, stepping slightly closer, his voice lowering as if this were a private courtesy rather than a dismissal. "It will make the transition smoother." The word transition hung in the air like a carefully chosen substitute for something harsher. Emily nodded once, not because she agreed, but because she understood the language he was speaking. Efficiency, closure, control. She picked up the pen, its weight heavier than expected, cool metal against her fingers, and for a second her reflection caught in the glossy surface of the table, a woman composed, still, almost unrecognizable from the one who used to laugh too easily. She pressed the pen to the paper, her hand steady, her signature forming with practiced precision, no hesitation, no visible emotion, just a clean line that separated what was from what would be, and when she finished, she set the pen down gently, as if even that small sound mattered. Daniel exhaled, a subtle release, not relief exactly, but confirmation. He gathered the papers without looking at her again, already shifting his attention to what came next. "My assistant will coordinate the rest," he said, and then, almost as an afterthought, "Take care of yourself." It was the kind of sentence that sounded appropriate but felt empty, like something learned rather than meant. Emily did not respond, she simply turned, her movements careful, measured, each step deliberate as she walked toward the door, the city skyline expanding in front of her as she moved, reflections of passing clouds sliding across the glass. Behind her the room remained unchanged, polished, controlled, untouched by what had just ended inside it. The elevator ride down was quiet, the soft hum of machinery the only sound accompanying her, the mirrored walls reflecting her from every angle, the curve of her belly more pronounced now in the enclosed space. She placed her hand there again, a habit that had become instinct, grounding. The baby shifted slightly, a small movement that felt larger than anything else in that moment, and she closed her eyes briefly, not in sadness, but in focus, as if listening to something deeper than the silence around her. When the doors opened, the lobby greeted her with bright lights and distant conversations, people moving in and out, unaware of the quiet turning point that had just taken place above them. Outside, the air carried the faint chill of early evening, a breeze moving through the streets, lifting strands of her hair as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Taxis passed, horns echoed, life continued with its usual rhythm. And for the first time since she entered that building, Emily allowed herself to pause, just for a second. Her phone buzzed in her bag, a small, persistent vibration. She hesitated before reaching for it, as if she already knew it was not just another message. The screen lit up with a single unread email. The subject line simple, almost understated. "It is time." No sender name, just an address she had not opened in months. Her thumb hovered above the screen, the city noise fading slightly as her focus narrowed, and without fully realizing why, she opened it. The message did not contain a greeting, it did not ask how she was, it did not explain itself. It simply opened into a clean interface with a single line at the top that read "Access restored." And for a second Emily just stood there on the sidewalk, the city moving around her, people brushing past, a cab pulling up at the curb, a distant siren echoing between buildings, but all of it felt slightly muted. Like she had stepped half an inch outside of the moment, her thumb scrolling slowly, revealing attachments, documents, timestamps, things she recognized without fully understanding yet. The name at the bottom appeared then, simple and direct, Julian Cross. And with it came a memory she had deliberately kept quiet, not hidden, but contained, something she had not allowed to surface while she was still living inside the version of her life that had just ended. She inhaled once, steady, then tapped the first file. The screen shifted to a contract draft, dense but precise, numbers aligned, terms outlined, and there it was, unmistakable even at a glance: valuation figures, acquisition structure, equity distribution, not hypothetical, not exploratory, finalized. Her name listed not as a participant, not as an advisor, but as the primary signatory. Emily Carter, Chief Architect. The title sat there without explanation, and yet it did not feel unfamiliar. It felt like something she had once been and had quietly set aside, something Daniel had never asked about because it did not fit the version of her he preferred. Something she had not corrected because at the time it seemed easier to let him believe she was smaller than she was. The breeze picked up slightly, cool against her skin. She shifted her weight, one hand still holding the phone, the other resting against her belly, grounding herself in the present even as the past began to rearrange itself in her mind. The long nights she spent working at her laptop after Daniel had gone to sleep, the calls she took in the hallway, quiet, deliberate, the way she always closed her screen when he walked in, not out of secrecy, but out of habit, because it was simpler than explaining something he had never shown interest in understanding. And now those pieces moved together with a clarity that had not existed before. Another notification appeared at the top of the screen, a message this time, short, direct, "We are ready when you are, location attached." She tapped it. A map opened, downtown, not far from where she stood, a building she recognized but had never entered, glass and steel, understated but powerful, the kind of place where decisions were made quietly and then announced loudly to the world later. She looked up instinctively, scanning the skyline, and there it was, just a few blocks away, its reflective surface catching the fading light of the afternoon, and for a moment she simply stared at it, not with hesitation, but with recognition, like seeing something that had always been part of her path but had been waiting for the right moment to become visible. A car passed close to the curb, the rush of air pulling her back into motion. She stepped forward, one foot then the next, not rushed, not uncertain, just moving, the phone still in her hand, the message still open, the words "it is time" echoing not as a command, but as a confirmation, and as she walked, something subtle but undeniable shifted in the way she held herself. Her shoulders no longer carrying the weight of what she had just left behind, but aligning instead with what was ahead, not louder, not dramatic, just different, and somewhere above, in a quiet office of glass and marble, Daniel Whitmore believed he had closed the chapter, unaware that in the same hour, without announcement, without permission, Emily had stepped into a story he had never even known existed. The building did not announce itself with noise or movement. It stood quiet and deliberate against the skyline, its glass surface reflecting the last stretch of daylight like a mirror that revealed nothing but precision, and as Emily approached the entrance, the rhythm of the city seemed to soften again, the rush of traffic fading into a distant hum, her footsteps measured against the smooth concrete, each one steady, intentional. The automatic doors opened without hesitation, and the temperature inside shifted immediately, cool, controlled, carrying the faint scent of polished surfaces and something almost metallic, like a place where decisions were made in silence rather than spectacle. The lobby was wide but not crowded, clean lines, soft lighting, a reception desk positioned with exact symmetry, and behind it a man in a dark suit looked up the moment she stepped inside, not surprised, not questioning, simply aware, as if her arrival had already been accounted for. "Ms. Carter," he said, not asking, confirming. And something in the way he said it made clear that this version of her was not new here, even if it felt newly visible. Emily nodded once, her hand instinctively resting at her side now rather than her stomach, her posture aligning with the space around her. "They are expecting you," he added, gesturing toward a set of elevators at the far end of the lobby. No paperwork, no delay, just access. The elevator doors closed with a soft precision, and as it began to rise, the digital numbers climbing one by one, Emily allowed herself a brief exhale, not of relief, but of focus, the mirrored interior reflecting her again. But this time the image felt different, not fragmented by uncertainty, but centered, as if the pieces that had been quietly forming beneath the surface were now aligning into something complete. The phone in her hand vibrated once more, another message from Julian Cross. Short, as always, conference room B, and beneath it, a single line, "We kept your seat." The word settled in a way that did not feel surprising, only inevitable. When the doors opened, the hallway beyond was quieter than the lobby, carpet soft underfoot, lighting warmer but still controlled, glass walls lining one side, revealing glimpses of rooms where people spoke in low tones, screens displaying data, charts, movement without chaos. And at the end of the corridor, a set of double doors stood slightly open, a subtle invitation rather than an announcement. Emily moved toward them without hesitation, her pace even, her breathing steady, the faint sound of voices inside growing clearer with each step, not loud, not hurried, but focused, purposeful. She reached the doorway and paused just long enough to take in the room, a long table, screens along the walls, a group of individuals already seated, their attention shifting toward her the moment she appeared, and then he stood, Julian Cross, exactly as she remembered, composed, attentive, his expression not surprised but resolved, like someone who had been waiting not for her arrival, but for this exact moment in time. "You made it," he said, not as a question, but as a quiet acknowledgement, and as Emily stepped into the room, something subtle but irreversible clicked into place, not in the space around her, but within her, because this was not where her story changed, this was where it had been leading all along. The room did not shift when she entered, it adjusted, like a system recognizing a missing piece returning to its place. Conversations paused not out of surprise but out of alignment, screens dimmed slightly as attention redirected, and for a brief second, the only sound was the soft closing of the door behind her, sealing the space into something focused and contained. Emily moved toward the table with a calm that did not need to be announced, her steps quiet against the floor, her presence settling into the room as if it had always belonged there. Julian remained standing until she reached her seat, then gave a small nod, the kind that carried more meaning than a welcome ever could. "We are on schedule," he said, his voice even, controlled, and one of the analysts near the screen tapped a control, bringing up a projection that filled the far wall with numbers, charts, and a single bold figure that anchored everything else, $2 billion, the valuation displayed without decoration, without exaggeration, just fact. Emily did not react outwardly, not because it was insignificant, but because it was already known, already processed. Her eyes moved across the screen, scanning details, timelines, structures, the acquisition strategy laid out in precise layers, and as she took it in, her mind moved with it, not catching up, but engaging, refining, adjusting. The quiet rhythm of someone who understood the system from the inside rather than observing it from the outside. Julian watched her for a moment, then shifted his attention to the rest of the room. "We proceed once she confirms," he said, not as a formality, but as a requirement, and that single sentence altered the weight of the space, because it made clear what had been unspoken until now. This was not a presentation for her, it was a decision that depended on her. Emily reached forward, fingertips brushing the edge of the table, grounding herself not in uncertainty, but in presence. The memory of the earlier afternoon flickered for a fraction of a second, the papers, the silence, the word solution, and then it was gone, replaced by something sharper, clearer. She straightened slightly. Her voice when it came was steady, measured, carrying without effort. "Walk me through the final clause adjustments." And immediately the room responded, the analyst stepping forward, the screen shifting to highlight the specific section, terms of control, equity distribution, post-acquisition leadership, each line precise, each word deliberate, and as the explanation unfolded, Emily listened without interruption, her expression focused, not passive, but actively processing, weighing not just what was being said, but what it meant beyond the surface. When the explanation ended, there was a brief pause, not empty, but expectant, and Emily leaned back slightly, her gaze steady on the screen before moving to Julian. "We keep operational control for 12 months post-acquisition," she said, not suggesting, deciding. "After that, transition phases in stages, not all at once." A small adjustment on paper, but one that shifted leverage, stability, outcome. Julian nodded once, already understanding the implication. "Done," he replied, and just like that, the structure tightened, refined, stronger than before. A folder was placed in front of her, clean, minimal, the final agreement, and for a moment the room grew quiet again, not tense, but aware. This was the point where intention became action, where everything moved from planning into reality. Emily looked down at the document, then at the pen resting beside it, the same simple object, but a different weight now, not an ending, but a beginning. She picked it up without hesitation, her hand steady, her breath even, and as she signed her name, the line forming with clarity and purpose, there was no sound beyond the faint movement of ink against paper. But in that silence, something shifted far beyond the room, because at that exact moment, without announcement, without spectacle, Emily Carter did not just step into power, she claimed it. For a moment after the pen left the paper, nothing happened, no applause, no sudden movement, just a quiet stillness that held the weight of what had just been set into motion, and then the room exhaled, not loudly, but collectively, screens refreshed, numbers updated, the deal moved from pending to confirmed, and somewhere beyond those walls, systems began to register the shift, markets preparing to react before most people even understood what had occurred, Julian closed the folder with a soft, deliberate motion. His expression unchanged but his posture slightly eased. "It is official," he said, and the words did not carry excitement, they carried certainty. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair, her hand resting again on her stomach, the subtle movement beneath her palm grounding her in something far more important than any contract. The baby shifted gently, and for the first time that day, a faint warmth crossed her expression, not visible enough for the room to read, but real enough for her to feel. She had not just secured a future for herself. She had secured one for someone who had not yet even seen the world. Across the table, one of the executives adjusted his glasses, already reviewing projections. "Media will pick this up within the hour," he said, more as a statement than a warning, and Julian nodded. "Let them," he replied, his attention briefly returning to Emily. "You will need to be visible," he added, not as pressure, but as acknowledgement of what came with this level of impact. Emily considered that for a second, not the visibility itself, but what it meant, the shift from private to public, from unseen to undeniable, and then she gave a small nod, not reluctant, not eager, simply accepting. "Schedule it," she said. The room moved again, assistants stepping in quietly, messages sent, timelines adjusted, everything flowing with a precision that mirrored the decision she had just made, and as the energy around her increased, Emily remained still for a moment longer, not disconnected, but centered, her thoughts not drifting backward, not toward the penthouse or the papers or the man who believed he had simplified his life, but forward, toward something that was now fully hers to shape. Her phone buzzed again, this time with notifications stacking quickly, headlines beginning to form in real time, acquisition confirmed, tech sector shifts overnight, anonymous sources reveal new leadership, the language still vague, still catching up, but the direction already clear, and she watched for a second as the world began to piece together a story she had been living quietly for far longer than anyone realized. Julian stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. "There is one more thing," he said, and she turned her attention back to him, his expression steady, but with a hint of something else beneath it, respect, perhaps, or recognition. "You never told him," he added, not needing to specify who, and Emily did not answer immediately, not because she needed time, but because the answer had already been decided long before this moment. She shook her head once, subtle, definitive. "He never asked," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, no regret, just a simple truth that explained everything without needing anything more. Julian held her gaze for a second, then nodded, understanding settling between them without further discussion, because some things did not need to be explained once they were seen clearly. Outside, the light had shifted, evening settling in, the glass walls reflecting a city that was still moving, still unaware of the exact moment its landscape had quietly changed, and as Emily stood, gathering nothing but her phone, her presence already lighter than when she had entered, it became clear that what had just happened was not a reaction to what she had lost, it was the continuation of something she had always been building. Just no longer hidden, no longer small, and somewhere across the city, in an office of glass and control, Daniel Whitmore had not yet seen the news, but it was already on its way to him. The notification did not arrive with drama. It appeared quietly on the edge of Daniel Whitmore's screen while he reviewed a financial report that no longer held his full attention, a small alert, easily dismissed, except for the number attached to it, $2 billion, and something about that number made him pause, his hand hovering over the trackpad for a fraction of a second before he clicked, the screen shifting instantly, replacing charts and projections with a headline that was still spreading, still forming, but already precise enough to register. Major tech acquisition confirmed, new leadership emerges. His eyes moved quickly across the article, scanning, filtering, searching for the detail that mattered, and then he saw it, not hidden, not emphasized, just placed there as fact. Emily Carter, chief architect, lead signatory. The words did not make sense at first, not because they were unclear, but because they did not align with the version of reality he had just finalized hours earlier. The office around him remained the same, glass walls, controlled lighting, the distant city stretching beyond his view, but something in the space shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the temperature had changed by a single degree, enough to notice if you were paying attention. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in confusion, the kind that comes when information does not fit into the structure you have built. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he read the line. Again, Emily Carter, not Emily Whitmore, not the woman he had just categorized and resolved, but a name standing on its own, attached to something far larger than he had ever associated with her. Behind him, the woman in the black dress glanced up from her phone, noticing the shift in his posture before the content of the screen. "What is it?" she asked, her tone casual, but Daniel did not answer immediately. He turned the screen slightly, just enough for her to see, and for a moment, the room held a different kind of silence, not controlled, not intentional, but reactive. She leaned in, reading quickly, her expression tightening for a fraction of a second before smoothing over again. "That cannot be the same person," she said, the words light, almost dismissive, but lacking conviction, and Daniel did not respond, because he was no longer looking at the headline, he was looking at the details beneath it, timestamps, deal structure, confirmed signatures, everything precise, everything verifiable, everything real. His phone buzzed next, then again, messages stacking faster than he could read them, colleagues, partners, names that usually contacted him with measured intent now reaching out with urgency. "Did you see this? Is this connected to you? Were you aware?" Each message a small fracture in the certainty he had carried just hours before. He did not open them yet, he did not respond, he simply stared at the screen. Replaying the afternoon in his mind, the papers, the signature, the quiet compliance he had interpreted as closure, and now, that same day, that same person, standing at the center of something he had not even known existed. The city outside continued as it always did, traffic moving, lights shifting, people unaware of the recalibration happening behind a sheet of glass high above the street, and Daniel remained still for a moment longer, the kind of stillness that comes before understanding begins to take shape, not fully formed yet, but enough to recognize that something had been missed, something significant, something irreversible, and for the first time since he had signed those papers, the outcome no longer felt clean, it felt incomplete. Like a decision made without all the information, and somewhere between realization and reaction, a single thought settled in, quiet but undeniable. He had not ended her story, he had stepped out of it. Daniel did not move immediately, but his stillness was no longer controlled, it was calculated, his mind already shifting from confusion to verification, from reaction to analysis, because uncertainty was something he had built his entire career on eliminating, and yet here it was, sitting in front of him, undeniable and expanding by the second. He reached for his phone. Not to respond to the messages flooding in, but to search directly, his fingers moving with practiced precision, pulling up multiple sources, cross-checking the information, financial platforms, press releases, internal alerts, and each one confirmed the same thing: the deal was real, the valuation was real, and the name attached to it remained unchanged. Emily Carter, not an error, not a coincidence, but a fact repeating itself across every credible channel. The woman across from him shifted slightly, crossing her arms, watching him now with more attention than before, the earlier dismissal gone, replaced by a subtle tension she could not fully mask. "You did not know about this," she said, this time not as a question, but as a realization, and Daniel did not answer right away, because the truth of that statement was still settling into place. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the desk, his eyes fixed on the screen as if the information might rearrange itself if he stared long enough, but it did not. It only became clearer, more detailed, more complete, press coverage updating in real time, analysts already discussing implications, competitors reacting, and somewhere within that flow of information, he began to see the pattern, not just the outcome, but the preparation behind it. This was not something that happened overnight, this was not a sudden opportunity taken at the right moment, this was planned, structured, executed with precision over time, which meant that while he had been building his version of their life, she had been building something entirely separate, something he had never seen because he had never looked. His jaw tightened again, but this time not from confusion, from recognition, the kind that comes when you realize the gap was not in the information, but in your perception. He opened another document, deeper analysis now, transaction history, partnerships, timelines, and there it was again, subtle but undeniable, traces of activity that extended back months, even years, small pieces that individually meant nothing, but together formed the structure he could not ignore, and suddenly the quiet nights, the closed laptop screens. The moments he had dismissed as routine began to rearrange themselves into something else entirely, not secrecy, but independence, not absence, but intention. His phone buzzed again, more aggressively now, a direct call this time. He glanced at the name, a senior partner, someone who rarely reached out without purpose, and for a second, Daniel considered ignoring it, but he answered, his voice controlled, even. "I have seen it," he said before the other person could speak, cutting through the expected questions. There was a pause on the other end, then a measured response. "Then you understand what this means?" And Daniel did not reply immediately. Because understanding was still forming, still shifting, but he knew enough to recognize that whatever this was, it extended beyond a single deal, beyond a single moment. It was a repositioning, a shift in landscape, and he was no longer standing where he thought he was. Across the room, the woman in black stepped back slightly, distancing herself not physically, but subtly, as if recalibrating her place in a situation that had just changed without warning, and Daniel noticed that too, not as a primary concern, but as another data point, another indicator of how quickly perception could shift once new information entered the equation. Outside, the city lights had fully taken over the skyline, reflections sharper now against the glass, and inside that office, the controlled environment no longer felt entirely stable, not because anything had visibly changed, but because the foundation of certainty had cracked just enough to let something else through, something unfamiliar, something he had not accounted for. And as Daniel ended the call, placing his phone down with deliberate care, one thought settled in with a clarity he could not ignore. He had not underestimated the situation, he had underestimated her. The shift did not stay contained within Daniel's office, it spread, quiet at first, then faster, like a ripple moving across a surface that had been perfectly still only moments before. Financial networks updated, analysts adjusted projections, and in conference rooms across the city, conversations changed direction without warning, because numbers at that scale did not remain isolated, they altered trajectories. And at the center of that shift, a name continued to appear with increasing clarity: Emily Carter, no longer a line in a report, but a point of focus. Daniel stood now, not abruptly, but with a controlled movement that masked the pace of his thoughts. He moved toward the window, looking out at the city he believed he understood, the grid of lights, the flow of traffic, the structure of systems he had navigated for years, and yet something in that familiar view felt different, not because the city had changed, but because his position within it had. He was no longer observing from certainty, he was recalibrating from incomplete information. Behind him, the screen remained active, headlines updating, commentary building, and one segment caught his attention as it refreshed, a brief clip, already circulating, already gaining traction, a controlled environment, a conference room, a figure seated at the center of a table, posture composed, presence unmistakable even in a short frame. Emily, not as he had seen her earlier that day, but as she was now being introduced to the world, steady, deliberate, aligned with something larger than the role he had assigned her. And as the clip looped, the contrast became unavoidable, not exaggerated, not dramatized, just real. His phone buzzed again, and this time he answered without hesitation, the same partner from before, voice sharper now, less measured. "We need clarity," the man said, direct. "Your name is being connected to her through past filings, shared assets, timeline overlaps." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in focus. "There is no operational connection," he replied, his tone firm, controlled. "Not anymore." The last two words settling differently than the rest, because for the first time, they carried a weight he had not anticipated. There was a pause on the other end, then a quieter response. "That may not be how it is interpreted." And Daniel understood that immediately. Perception moved faster than fact, and in this moment, perception was already forming without his input. He ended the call and turned back toward the desk, the room no longer feeling like a place of control, but a place of reaction, and that difference, though subtle, was significant. Across the room, the woman in black had already picked up her bag, her movements composed, but her distance now more defined. "I have another engagement," she said, her voice neutral, but the timing unmistakable. Daniel nodded once, not stopping her, not questioning, because he understood what that meant. Alignment shifted when value shifted, and right now, the equation had changed. When the door closed behind her, the room felt larger, quieter, and for a moment, Daniel allowed the silence to settle, not avoiding it, not filling it, just letting it exist long enough for the next thought to form clearly. He reached for his phone again, not to check the news, not to respond to partners, but to open a contact he had not expected to use so soon. Emily Carter. The name sat there, unchanged. Familiar in a way that now felt incomplete. His thumb hovered for a second, not out of doubt, but calculation, and then he pressed call. The line rang once, twice, steady, consistent, each tone carrying more weight than the last, and somewhere across the city, in a building of glass and quiet power, a phone vibrated against a polished table, not ignored, not rushed, simply waiting, because timing, as Emily now understood better than anyone, was not about urgency, it was about control. The phone vibrated once, then again, steady against the surface of the table, the sound soft but persistent, and for a moment, no one in the room moved to acknowledge it, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because every sound now carried weight, every interruption carried meaning. Emily glanced at the screen without reaching for it immediately, the name displayed clearly, Daniel Whitmore, and for a brief second, the room seemed to narrow, not with tension, but with focus, as if, even, the air understood that this moment was not random, it was inevitable. Julian noticed the shift in her attention but said nothing, his posture unchanged, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because some decisions were not made in conversation, they were made in silence. The phone continued its quiet rhythm, and Emily let it ring once more before finally reaching forward, her fingers closing around it with calm precision. She did not rush, she did not hesitate, she simply answered, lifting it to her ear as if it were any other call, her voice steady, neutral. "Hello?" On the other end, there was a fraction of a pause, not long enough to be noticed by most, but enough to register as adjustment, as Daniel recalibrated from expectation to reality. "Emily," he said, her name sounding different now, not unfamiliar, but no longer positioned above her, more level, more measured, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer empty, but filled with everything that had changed in the span of a single day. Emily did not fill it, she allowed it to exist, her gaze drifting briefly toward the glass wall where the city lights reflected in layered patterns, her hand resting lightly against the table, grounded, present, while Daniel continued, his tone controlled but lacking the certainty it held earlier. "I saw the announcement," he said, the words simple, but carrying more beneath them, acknowledgement, confusion, something else he had not yet named, and Emily responded just as simply, "It was finalized this afternoon." No elaboration, no explanation, just fact. There was another pause, shorter this time, sharper, and when Daniel spoke again, the structure of his voice shifted slightly, less formal, more direct. "You did not mention any of this," he said, not accusatory, not emotional, but searching, and Emily's response came without delay, without change in tone. "You did not ask." The same truth, now spoken aloud, and on the other end of the line, that answer settled in a way that left no space for argument, no angle for reinterpretation, just clarity. Daniel exhaled quietly, the sound barely audible, and when he spoke again, the words carried a different weight. "This changes things?" he said, and for the first time, it was not a statement of control, but of recognition, and Emily's eyes remained steady, her posture unchanged. "It clarifies them," she replied, her voice calm, precise, and in that single sentence, the difference between them became undeniable. He was reacting to change, she was defining it. Across the room, no one moved, no one interrupted, the quiet respect of a space that understood the significance of what was being said without needing to hear every word, and Daniel continued, his tone shifting once more, searching for alignment. "We should talk," he said, the suggestion simple, but carrying an implication he had not needed before, and Emily did not respond immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she was choosing the timing, the terms, the position, and when she spoke, her voice remained even. "We are talking," she said, and the meaning behind it was clear. This was not a conversation to return to the past. This was a conversation happening exactly where it needed to, in the present, on her terms. There was no argument after that, no attempt to push further, just a quiet understanding forming on the other end of the line. And as the call came to its natural pause, Emily lowered the phone slightly, not ending it abruptly, but not extending it either, because some conversations did not need conclusions, they needed recognition, and in that moment, both of them understood something that could not be undone. Not by words, not by timing, not by regret, that what had shifted was not temporary. It was permanent, and as Emily finally ended the call, placing the phone back on the table with the same quiet precision she had shown all day, the room around her remained calm, unchanged on the surface. But beneath it, everything had already moved forward. The room did not rush back into motion after the call ended, it held its pace, controlled, deliberate, as if everyone inside understood that what had just happened was not an interruption but a confirmation. Emily remained seated for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly against the table, her gaze steady but distant, not lost, just processing the quiet shift that had settled into place. Because there was a difference between knowing something had changed and feeling the full weight of that change, and this was the moment where both aligned. Julian was the first to speak, not loudly, not to break the silence, but to continue the rhythm of the room. "Press is ready when you are," he said, his tone measured, respectful, not directing, but offering, and Emily turned her attention back to him with a small nod, her focus returning fully to the present. 5 minutes, she replied, her voice calm, steady, the kind of tone that did not need to be raised to carry authority. Across the table, assistants moved quietly, devices checked, schedules confirmed, the machinery of visibility beginning to engage, and Emily stood slowly, not out of hesitation, but with awareness of the moment, her posture aligning again with the space, her presence no longer transitioning, but established. She adjusted the sleeve of her dress slightly, a small, grounding gesture, and then began to walk toward the glass wall that overlooked the city, the lights outside now fully alive, each one part of a system that was already responding to what she had set into motion. Her phone remained on the table for a second before she reached back for it, the screen still lit from the call that had just ended, the contact name no longer carrying the same meaning it had only hours before, and without lingering, she locked the screen and placed it in her hand, not as something she needed, but as something she controlled. Behind her, the doors opened quietly as a media coordinator stepped in, offering a brief nod. "They are ready." And Emily turned, her expression composed, not rehearsed, not forced, simply clear. She walked forward without pause, her steps even, her focus steady, and as she moved through the hallway once more, the environment seemed to adjust around her, people stepping aside not out of obligation, but recognition, because presence at that level did not need to be announced, it was felt. In another part of the city, Daniel remained standing by the window, his phone now silent, the earlier flood of messages slowing as information settled into accepted fact. He had not called again, he had not followed up, because there was nothing left to clarify in the way he was used to. This was not a negotiation, not a correction, it was a realization, and as he stood there, looking out at the same skyline he had always believed he understood, something in his expression had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to register. The certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, more complex, the understanding that what he had dismissed as an ending had been, for her, a beginning he had never seen. Back in the corridor, Emily reached the final set of doors, the soft murmur of voices beyond them carrying a different kind of energy now, expectation, attention, anticipation, and she paused. For just a fraction of a second, not to gather herself, but to acknowledge the transition from private to public, from unseen to undeniable. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach once more, a small, grounding touch, and then she stepped forward, the doors opening smoothly, lights spilling across the floor, cameras already positioned, microphones waiting, and as she entered, the room shifted its focus instantly. Not because she demanded it, but because she held it, and in that moment. Without raising her voice, without changing her pace, Emily Carter did not just walk into the spotlight, she defined it. The lights did not feel harsh as they turned toward her, they felt precise, focused, like every lens in the room had already decided where it needed to be, and as Emily stepped fully into view, the quiet murmur of voices settled into stillness, cameras adjusted, microphones lifted slightly, and for a brief moment, there was no sound except the faint hum of equipment and the soft click of someone preparing to record. She did not rush to the podium, she did not look around for reassurance, she simply walked forward with the same steady rhythm she had carried all day, her posture aligned, her expression calm, her presence filling the space without effort. When she reached the front, she paused, not for effect, but for clarity, allowing the room to settle completely before she spoke, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the podium, the other near her side grounded, present, and when her voice came, it was not loud, but it carried, clear and deliberate. "Today marks a transition," she said, not announcing herself, not explaining, just setting the frame, and the room leaned into that sentence, not physically, but with attention, because there was something in the way she spoke that did not ask for validation, it assumed understanding would follow. She continued without hesitation, outlining the structure of the deal, the direction of the company, the intent behind the decisions that had already begun to ripple through the industry, her words measured, precise, each one placed with intention, not for impact, but for accuracy, and as she spoke, the earlier narrative that had defined her began to dissolve quietly, replaced by something far more substantial. Not constructed in that moment, but revealed. Questions followed, not chaotic, not overlapping, but steady, controlled, each one attempting to define, to understand, to position what had just occurred, and Emily responded the same way she had spoken, directly, without unnecessary elaboration. When asked about the scale of the acquisition, she spoke about long-term infrastructure. When asked about leadership, she spoke about continuity and stability. And when a voice from the back of the room shifted the tone slightly, asking about the timing, about the sudden visibility, about how quickly everything had changed, Emily paused for a fraction of a second, not caught off guard, but choosing the exact shape of her response. "It did not change quickly," she said, her gaze steady. "It became visible." And that sentence settled into the room with a quiet weight, because it reframed everything, not as a sudden rise, but as a long process finally seen, and in that reframing, the narrative moved from surprise to recognition. Cameras continued to capture every angle, every word, the story already forming in real time across platforms, headlines sharpening, language adjusting, and through it all, Emily remained unchanged in her presence, not performing, not reacting, simply existing within the role she had already defined for herself. In another building, across the same city, Daniel watched part of that conference on a muted screen, the captions moving steadily beneath her image, and as he read her words without hearing her voice, the meaning did not lessen. If anything, it became clearer, because stripped of tone, stripped of delivery, what remained was structure, intention, and he recognized that now, not as something new, but as something he had overlooked. Back in the room, the final question was asked, softer than the others, more personal in tone. "What does this moment mean to you?" And for the first time, Emily allowed a small shift in her expression, not a smile, not emotion displayed, but a subtle acknowledgement of the question itself. She considered it briefly, then answered with the same clarity she had carried throughout. "It means I do not need to explain my value anymore," she said, and as the words settled, there was no need for emphasis, no need for elaboration, because the room, the cameras, the city beyond the glass, all understood exactly what she meant, and in that understanding, something final and unspoken closed quietly behind her, not with sound, but with certainty. The room did not erupt when she finished speaking, it settled. The kind of quiet that follows something understood rather than something performed. Cameras remained fixed for a moment longer as if reluctant to break away, then slowly, deliberately, they lowered, conversations resumed in low tones, controlled, measured, because even in movement, the weight of what had just been said remained in the air. Emily stepped back from the podium without hesitation, without looking for reaction. Her posture unchanged, her pace steady as she moved through the same doors she had entered, but this time the space behind her felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had. The hallway greeted her again with its quiet precision, the soft lighting, the muted footsteps, and as she walked, the sound of her heels against the floor carried a rhythm that felt final in a way the earlier silence had not final as an ending, but final as in defined. Nothing left to prove, nothing left to adjust, just forward movement, clean and certain. Julian fell into step beside her after a moment. Not immediately, not intrusively, but aligned. "They will be talking about this for a long time," he said, not as a compliment, but as a fact, and Emily glanced toward the glass wall briefly, the city stretching beyond it, lights steady, systems moving. "They can," she replied, her voice even. "It does not change the work." And that was the difference, not in ambition, not in scale, but in focus. Where others saw the moment, she saw the continuation. The elevator ride down felt shorter this time, not because of time itself, but because there was no weight pulling it longer, no hesitation stretching each second, just motion, smooth, uninterrupted. When the doors opened, the lobby mirrored the one she had entered earlier, but the energy was different now, subtle, but present. The receptionist straightened slightly, eyes following her with recognition rather than curiosity. Doors opened before she reached them, not by request, but by awareness. And outside, the night air met her with a calm that felt earned rather than accidental. She paused for a moment at the edge of the sidewalk, not out of uncertainty, but to take in the space around her, the city moving in its constant rhythm, unaware of the exact point where one story had ended and another had taken shape. Her hand moved again to her stomach, the small, instinctive gesture grounding her not in the past, but in what was ahead, the future no longer something distant or abstract, but something already forming, already secured in ways that went beyond contracts and headlines. Across the city, in a high office framed by glass and reflection, Daniel remained where he had been, but the stillness around him was no longer the same, the screen in front of him now quiet. The headlines settled into certainty, and in that quiet, he understood something that had not been clear before, not in the moment he signed the papers, not even when he saw the announcement, but now, in the absence of noise. He saw the full shape of it. He had not lost her in a single decision, he had been losing her long before he ever noticed. In every moment he chose not to look deeper, not to ask, not to understand, and by the time he acted, the outcome had already been decided, just not by him. Back on the street, Emily stepped forward, merging into the movement of the city without needing to stand apart from it, her pace steady, her direction clear, no longer defined by what she had left behind, but by what she had chosen to build, and as she disappeared into the rhythm of lights and motion, there was no dramatic ending, no final declaration, just a quiet, undeniable truth settling into place. Some men lose everything they thought they owned, only to realize too late that the one thing they never truly understood was the value of the woman who chose to walk away.